August 1, 1944, Tinian Island. The air hung thick with the ghosts of explosions. A wet green smell of crushed jungle bled into the metallic tang of cordite. Fumiko pressed her face against the damp earth, the grit of coral sand scoring her cheek. Her nurse's uniform, once white, was a canvas of mud and sweat. Sounds swam in the heat, the crackle of unseen fires, the distant rhythmic crash of surf, and a new sound, heavy rhythmic crunching, boots on coral, coming closer. She had seen the others, the women who had run for the cliffs. She heard their final cries carried on the wind. Her own orders had been clear, a single grenade, small and dense in her pocket, one for the enemy, one for the Emperor, but her hands, slick with grime, trembled. The pin felt impossibly small, the crunching stopped. A shadow fell over her, long, impossibly long. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a white noise of prayers and propaganda films. The devils. The hairy, horned devils from across the sea. Her body tensed for the bayonet, for the violation she had been promised was her only fate in their hands. A boot nudged her shoulder. Gently, the pressure was firm, not a kick. She flinched, a small animal sound escaping her throat. Muffled words rumbled above her, a language of gravel and rock. Another nudge. She refused to move. To look was to confirm the horror. Better to die with the image of home behind her eyelids. Then something changed. The shadow shifted. A metallic scrape, then a sloshing sound. A canteen, dented and green, was placed on the ground beside her head. The man's hand entered her vision first. Large, covered in fine, light-colored hair, the knuckles raw, the hand retreated. The boots crunched, moving away. She lay there, listening, until his footsteps faded, replaced again by the fire and the sea. The canteen remained, a silent, incomprehensible fact on the ruined earth. The initial shock was not the violence, but its absence. For Fumiko and the thousands of other Japanese women, nurses, administrative staff, civilian auxiliaries, and the euphemistically named comfort women, captured on islands like Tinian, Saipan, and Okinawa, the world had been turned inside out. They were the support structure of the Imperial Japanese Army, cogs in a machine fueled by an ideology of absolute spiritual supremacy. Their reality was defined by scarcity, rigid hierarchy, and a fierce, desperate nationalism. They were taught that Japan was a divine nation, its people superior, its spirit, the Yamato Damashire, an unconquerable force. The Americans were the inverse, materialistic beasts, cowardly and cruel, lacking in culture and honor. Capture was not an option. It was a defilement worse than death. The military handbooks and the daily lectures were explicit. American soldiers would torture the men and rape the women. They would desecrate the bodies. Suicide was the only path to preserving one's purity and honor. On Saipan, whole families had thrown themselves from the cliffs, mothers clutching their children, rather than fall into enemy hands. This was the system of belief they carried in their bones, a certainty as solid as the volcanic rock of the islands they defended. But the system processing them now was not one of demonic cruelty. It was a different kind of system, one of bewildering, impersonal efficiency. Instead of torture chambers, they were led to delousing stations. Lines of women, silent and shamed, were sprayed with a fine, acrid mist that clung to their hair and clothes. Instead of being left to starve, they were handed metal trays piled with strange, odorous food. A thick stew with beans and meat, hard biscuits in a can, a small, dark bar that melted in the tropical heat. They were organized, counted, and loaded onto trucks and ships, not with the frenzied rage they had expected, but with a kind of weary, logistical competence. The American men directing them were not monsters. They were simply large, taller than any men the women had ever seen, with broad shoulders and long limbs. They moved with a casual ease, their bodies not clenched in the rigid discipline of the imperial soldier. They chewed gum. They sometimes smiled, revealing teeth that were startlingly white and even. For a woman like Haru, a typist from Yokohama, this was the first deep fissure in her reality. The devils were not supposed to have good dental hygiene. The propaganda had painted a clear, stark image. The reality that replaced it was a collage of confusing, contradictory details. The binary of Japanese honor versus American barbarism began to dissolve under a daily barrage of small, observable facts. The core tension was not between good and evil, but between what had been promised and what was now present. It was a contrast played out in the most tangible of terms. The first point of comparison was sound. They had been taught to expect the guttural roars of beasts. They heard instead a language of drawls and clipped commands, but also of laughter. The American men laughed often, loud and unguarded, a sound of casual confidence that was deeply unnerving. A young guard, seeing a group of women struggling to understand an order, might mimic the action of eating or drinking, his gestures clumsy but his intent clear. No shouting, no blows. The second contrast was in resources. The Japanese women were accustomed to a world of meticulous rationing and making do. A single grain of rice was precious. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. The Americans, by contrast, existed in a state of stunning, almost offensive, abundance. They handed out cigarettes as if they were infinite. A nurse named Sachiko watched, mesmerized, as a medic treated a small cut on a prisoner's arm. He opened a sterile paper packet to reveal a fresh bandage, applied a yellow powder from a shaker, and then threw the leftover packaging on the ground. The wastefulness was breathtaking. It felt like a form of power in itself, a careless disregard for limits that she couldn't comprehend. The sheer volume of their material was a constant, silent argument against the Japanese creed of spiritual strength overcoming material lack. Apparently, spirit could not compete with warehouses that never emptied. Finally, the most intimate contrast was in the treatment of the body. The women had been prepared for the ultimate violation. The men they encountered, however, were largely governed by a code of impersonal distance. There were medical examinations, which were humiliating, but they were conducted with a clinical detachment by medics who seemed more bored than predatory. When guards herded them from one place to another, they rarely touched them. If a woman stumbled, a hand might shoot out to steady her, but it would retreat just as quickly. This was perhaps the most disorienting fact of all. The Americans' power was so absolute they didn't seem to need to prove it on the women's bodies. They had other, bigger ways of demonstrating dominance. Their control was in the schedules they set, the food they distributed, the fences they erected. It was systemic. For these women, who came from a culture where a woman's body was a repository of family and national honor, this lack of personal violation was a profound psychological puzzle. It didn't feel like mercy. It felt like indifference. These dissonances were not processed as abstract political ideas. They were felt and catalogued by individual women, each filtering the new reality through her own experience. For Akiko, the young nurse from Nagasaki, the world shrank to the size of a medical tent. She had spent the last year on Saipan trying to save men with no sulfur, no plasma, and barely enough clean water. She had packed wounds with moss. She had held the hands of boys dying from gangrene because she had nothing to give them but a few comforting lies. Now, in the American-run camp hospital, she watched them unpack crate after crate of penicillin. They had so much of it they used it for minor infections. Her first reaction was a hot, sharp spike of anger. How many of her boys could have been saved by a single one of those crates? Her training took over. She watched the American medics' techniques, their sterile procedures, the way they triaged patients based on probability of survival, a cold calculus she understood. One day, a doctor, seeing her watching, gestured for her to help. He needed another pair of hands to hold a patient still. She complied, her movements swift and sure. He nodded, a small gesture of professional respect. In that moment, she wasn't a prisoner, she was a nurse. The shared language of medicine was more real than the language of war. Her internal monologue was a constant, running tally. They use sterile gauze for every dressing. They have 3 types of sutures. Their morphine comes in single-use ampules. It was an inventory of her own army's defeat. Meanwhile, Hani, the typist, observed the social architecture of the camp. She had an eye for status and hierarchy. In the Japanese army, the lines were bright and immovable. An officer never spoke to an enlisted man as an equal. He delivered commands from a great height. Here, she saw American officers and enlisted men sharing coffee, arguing over a card game, calling each other by their first names. The casual familiarity was shocking. She watched a young private, barely 20, tell a captain a joke. The captain laughed. Hani tried to imagine a Japanese private telling his captain a joke and could only picture the brutal beating that would follow. It wasn't that the Americans had no hierarchy, they clearly did. But it seemed more flexible, less total. It did not seem to demand the constant performance of submission from those on the bottom. She noted how they treated the Japanese male prisoners. They were still the enemy, but the GIs didn't seem to carry the same level of personal, ideological hatred. They seemed to view the Japanese soldiers less as existential threats and more as a job to be managed. Then there was Chio, an older woman who had run a mess hall. Her world was one of logistics, calories, and supply chains. She had spent months trying to figure out how to feed 200 men with a few sacks of weevil-eaten rice and whatever roots they could dig up. Her first meal in the POW camp was a revelation: canned peaches. The syrupy sweetness was an explosion in her mouth, a taste of a world she had forgotten existed. She watched the American cooks in their field kitchens. They worked with an unhurried rhythm, opening enormous cans, stirring vast pots. They threw away mountains of peelings, coffee grounds, and bread crusts. Chio found herself staring at the trash heaps, mentally calculating the number of meals she could have made from what they discarded. To her, this wasn't about kindness or cruelty. It was about physics. It was about an engine that ran on limitless fuel versus one that had long since run dry. She once saw a single supply ship unloading on the horizon and understood, in a way no propaganda could ever teach her, that the war was already over. It had been over for a long time. The unexpected humanity of the American captors was not a product of spontaneous individual virtue. It was the result of a deliberate, calculated system. The United States military, learning from the First World War and adhering to the frameworks of the Geneva Conventions, had established a clear and replicable architecture for handling prisoners of war. This system had a dual purpose. The first was pragmatic, to gather intelligence. A prisoner who was treated humanely was more likely to provide useful information than one who was tortured. Interrogators were trained to build rapport, to exploit psychological weaknesses, not just to apply physical force. The second purpose was strategic, psychological warfare. Every prisoner who was treated well and survived was a potential messenger. Leaflets dropped over Japanese-held territory promised food, medical care, and safety to those who surrendered. For soldiers and civilians on the brink of starvation, this message, once proven true, could be a powerful incentive to lay down their arms. The American war machine understood that morale was as critical a target as an ammunition depot. The women experienced this system as a series of strange, disconnected rituals. First, the collection point on the beach, where they were searched for weapons. Then the transport, often in the same landing craft that had brought the invaders ashore. Next, the processing center. Here, the infrastructure of bureaucracy took over. They were photographed. Their names were recorded, or attempts were made to record them, by young American clerks who struggled with the Japanese syllables. They were given medical checks, a process that felt invasive but was methodical, not malicious. A nurse named Emmy watched as a doctor carefully examined a festering wound on an older woman's leg, cleaning it with practiced motions. He didn't speak to her, but his hands were gentle. This was the system in action, a set of standard operating procedures designed to turn chaotic battlefield captures into manageable assets. The entire process was underwritten by an invisible but immense logistical train. The delousing powder, the medical supplies, the sea rations, the tents, the paperwork, it all flowed from a source of material wealth so vast it was, to the Japanese women, functionally infinite. They were being defeated not by men, but by factories. Chio, observing the perfect uniformity of the canned goods, the identical weave of the canvas tents, saw the stamp of mass production on her own captivity. It was a power that derived its strength from standardization and scale, a concept fundamentally alien to the Japanese ideal of individual spirit. The kindness they were experiencing was, in a sense, a line item on a budget, a strategic expenditure in the currency of war. It was the most sophisticated weapon they had yet encountered. As days turned into weeks in the holding camps, a new and even more unsettling contrast began to take shape. It was not between the Japanese and the Americans, but between the Japanese women and the Japanese men with whom they were now imprisoned. In the social order of the home islands and the front lines, the men had been the undisputed center of authority. Their power was absolute, but here, in the wire-fenced enclosures, that power was gone. Stripped of their weapons, their rank, and their purpose, many of the Japanese officers and soldiers seemed to collapse. Their rigid discipline, which had been their greatest strength, now became a source of friction and cruelty in the confines of the camp. Hani watched as a Japanese lieutenant, a man who was now as powerless as she was, slapped a private for not bowing correctly. The gesture was absurd, a phantom limb of authority still twitching. The private, starved and defeated, took the blow without flinching. It was a scene of familiar, ingrained brutality, now rendered meaningless. By contrast, the American Guard seemed to inhabit their own skins with a comfort and ease that was both compelling and foreign. Their authority came from the rifle on their shoulder and the keys on their belt, not from a constantly performed social dominance. They were often young, barely out of their teens, and possessed a sort of guileless curiosity about their prisoners. They would try to teach the children a few words of English or trade cigarettes for small trinkets. One guard, a tall boy from Ohio with a friendly, open face, showed Hanny a worn photograph of his mother and sister. She couldn't understand his words, but the image was universal. A small, painful flicker of connection. This informal, almost gentle power stood in stark relief against the brittle, theatrical dominance of the captive Japanese officers. The women began to see their own men with new eyes. They saw their cruelty not as a sign of strength, but as a symptom of a deep, gnawing insecurity. The Americans' confidence seemed to need no such reinforcement. They were so certain of their victory that they could afford to be casual. This inversion of power was deeply destabilizing. The men who were supposed to be their protectors were now just other prisoners, often more broken and lost than they were. The very foundation of the women's world was a set of powerful, unspoken assumptions. The emperor was a living god. The Japanese race was pure and superior. A woman's duty was to serve, endure, and if necessary, die for the nation. The American POW camp was a laboratory designed to systematically dismantle every one of these beliefs. The ideological clash was not a debate, it was a lived experience. When an American medic respectfully asked Akiko for her opinion on how to treat a patient's tropical ulcer, it was more than a medical consultation. It was a role inversion of seismic proportions. In the Japanese military hospital, a nurse would never be asked for her opinion by a doctor. She would be given an order. Here, her competence was being recognized, her knowledge valued. She found herself speaking with an authority she didn't know she possessed, pointing to the wound, using a mixture of broken English and gestures to explain her reasoning. The American doctor listened, and then he nodded and followed her advice. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating. It violated the natural order of things. This subtle restoration of agency was a recurring theme. The women were prisoners, yes, but their skills were often useful. The cooks, like Chio, were sometimes put to work in the kitchens, where they could exercise a small measure of control over the food, adapting the strange American ingredients to more familiar tastes for their fellow prisoners. The typists, like Hanny, might be asked to help with administrative tasks, cataloging the names of the captured. Each small act of competence was a rebellion against the role of helpless victim they had been assigned by both their captors and their own culture. As they worked, they processed the contradictions around them. How could the demonic enemy value their skills? How could the inferior race have produced a medical system so clearly superior to their own? The questions hung in the humid air, unspoken. They had been taught that their strength was spiritual. But the evidence of their eyes suggested that the Americans' strength was practical, and that the practical was overwhelming the spiritual at every turn. Was it possible that the entire ideology that had led them to this island, to this war, was not just wrong, but a fatal delusion? The evidence supporting this terrifying new hypothesis was not philosophical. It was piled in crates, written in logs, and consumed daily. It was a series of concrete, quantifiable facts that, taken together, formed an unassailable argument. Consider the daily food intake. A standard American sea ration provided over 3,000 calories. It contained units of meat, biscuits, soluble coffee, sugar, and often a small packet of cigarettes or candy. For women like Chio, who had been trying to sustain life on a few hundred calories of watery rice and boiled weeds, the sheer energy content of the American diet was a strategic document. She noticed that after a few weeks in the camp, the Japanese prisoners began to regain weight. Their skin lost its sallow color. They were physically being rebuilt by their enemy's surplus. This was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of calories. Then there was the evidence of the medical ledgers, which Akiko sometimes glimpsed in the camp infirmary. Lists of supplies, inventories of drugs, penicillin measured in hundreds of thousands of units, quinine for malaria, morphine for pain, blood plasma, stored in refrigerated boxes. The sheer quantity was one thing, but the diversity was another. The Americans had a specific tool for every problem. Their medicine was a system of overwhelming specificity and power. Akiko thought of the death wards in her own hospital, where men with infections were sent to die because there was nothing left to be done. The memory was a source of a quiet, burning shame. The records she saw now were not just lists of supplies. They were a testament to a different philosophy of war, one where preserving the life of a single soldier was a logistical priority. The psychological warfare leaflets, which they had once burned as enemy lies, now read like prophecy. One, pulled from the pocket of a dead soldier weeks before, had promised, "Those who surrender will be given food, water, and medical treatment." At the time, it had seemed like a transparent, almost laughable trick. Now the women were living its literal truth. The most powerful evidence of all, however, was in the numbers that trickled through the camp grapevine. On Saipan alone, over 20,000 Japanese civilians had died, the vast majority by their own hands, leaping from cliffs or detonating grenades in caves. They had chosen death based on a description of the enemy that the women in the camps now knew to be false. They had died for a lie. This realization was a quiet horror. It meant that their friends, their families, had not died for the emperor. They had died because of a failure of information. They had been killed by their own propaganda. The slow, steady demolition of a worldview is a violent internal process. It incurs a heavy psychological cost, paid out in the quiet hours of the night. For many women, the initial fear of the American guards slowly transformed into a more complex and corrosive set of emotions: shame, confusion, and a profound, disorienting grief. The shame was the shame of surrender, an act their culture had defined as the ultimate disgrace. Yet this shame was complicated by the undeniable, animal relief of being alive. To be safe, to have food, to not be in constant fear for one's life, these were powerful sedatives. The conflict between the indoctrinated duty to die and the primal instinct to live created a state of perpetual, low-grade internal conflict. Then came the grief. It was not just grief for the dead, but grief for the death of a world. The Japan they had believed in divine, invincible, morally superior was a phantom. They had sacrificed everything for it, and it had proven to be an illusion. Hanny would lie on her cot at night and trace the arc of her own life, from a schoolgirl waving a flag at a military parade in Tokyo to a prisoner in a wire cage on a forgotten Pacific island. The story no longer made sense. The plot had been revealed as a fiction. The kindness of their captors was, in some ways, the cruelest blow. It denied them the clean, simple narrative of righteous victimhood. It was much easier to hate a monster than to feel a confusing sense of gratitude toward a conqueror. One night, a guard quietly left a small pile of candy near a group of children. The gesture was small, almost certainly against regulations. The mother of one of the children began to weep, silent, racking sobs in the darkness. She was not crying from fear or sadness, but from a sense of utter, soul-shattering confusion. The world had become morally illegible. This was the true cost of survival, the loss of certainty. The enemy was no longer a simple object of hate, and if the enemy was not what they were told, then who were they? The revelation, when it arrived, was not a lightning strike of political awakening. It was a quiet, pragmatic conclusion born of observation, a thought that crystallized in the mind of a woman like Chio as she watched Americans unload a supply truck. It was a single, devastating sentence. The Americans' kindness was not a feature of their character, but a function of their supply chain. This was the turn. This was the insight that reordered everything that had come before. It was not that the American men were inherently better or more moral than the Japanese men. It was that they could afford to be. Their system of production and logistics created such a vast surplus that generosity became a viable and even efficient military tactic. It was cheaper to feed a prisoner than to fight him to the death. It was more effective to win his reluctant compliance with food and medicine than to cow him with brutality. This insight had three immediate and powerful implications. First, it reframed the entire moral landscape. The humanity the women were experiencing was not necessarily a reflection of the individual souls of the guards. It was a reflection of the national wealth of the United States. It was the product of Detroit factories, of California farms, of a logistical network that could project overwhelming material force across an entire ocean. The second implication was that the Japanese ideology of spiritual superiority, the Yamato spirit, was not just a belief system, but a coping mechanism for material poverty. The nation had been forced to fetishize spirit because it lacked steel, to praise sacrifice because it lacked food, to glorify death because it lacked the means to sustain life. The third implication was the most personal and painful. It meant that the cruelty of their own officers, the disregard for the lives of their own soldiers, was not a sign of strength or discipline, but a symptom of desperation. A system operating at the edge of starvation and collapse has no room for generosity. Brutality becomes its own form of efficiency. Their leaders were not gods. They were just men who had run out of options. This revelation was not triumphant. It was profoundly sad. It replaced a world of gods and devils with a world of systems, a world of full and empty warehouses. This new understanding allowed the women to synthesize their fragmented experiences into a coherent, if painful, whole. The individual moments, the offered canteen, the sterile bandage, the shared photograph were not random acts. They were data points illustrating a larger truth. The cause of their unexpected survival was the American system of logistics-driven warfare. The effect was the systematic dismantling of their own ideological framework. The personal became political, and the political became logistical. This perspective tended to cool the emotional turmoil. The individual American Guard was no longer a source of confusion. He was an agent of a system, a man doing a job according to a set of procedures. His personal character was almost irrelevant. This depersonalization was a relief. It meant they did not have to grapple with the possibility that their enemies were simply better people. They only had to accept that their enemies were part of a better resourced system. This analytical distance allowed them to see the connections between disparate events. The wastefulness of the American field kitchens and the availability of penicillin in their infirmaries were two sides of the same coin: industrial surplus. The casual confidence of the American GIs and the brittle cruelty of the Japanese officers were also linked. One was the psychology of abundance, the other the psychology of scarcity. They saw how motifs from their old life echoed in the new one. The hands of their own men, which had once been symbols of strength and authority, now seemed small and ineffective. The hands of the Americans, which had at first seemed so threatening, were now seen for what they were. The hands of well-fed boys, hands that operated machines, drove trucks, and dispensed the overwhelming material output of a distant continent. The women's own hands, which had been trained to serve and heal within a system of scarcity, were now learning to receive, to accept the logic of a new reality. The world was not a spiritual contest, it was a material one, and the war had been won by the side with the fuller hands. The memory of that first day on Tinian, of the canteen of water left beside her head, never left Fumiko. It became a touchstone, a moment when one reality ended and another began. Months later, in a camp in Hawaii, the experience was repeated, but the meaning had changed. A young guard, on his way off duty, tossed her a bar of chocolate over the wire fence. He smiled and kept walking. In that moment, she felt no fear, no shock, no ideological confusion. The gesture, once so extraordinary, had become routine. It was just a small transaction in a vast, impersonal system she now partially understood. She picked up the chocolate, unwrapped it, and began to eat. The sweetness was no longer a surprise. It was simply a fact. How does our understanding of conflict change when we look at it not as a clash of wills, but as a collision of systems? When victory is determined less by the courage of soldiers and more by the efficiency of supply depots and the output of factories. The experience of these Japanese women offers a lens through which we can see war not as a drama of heroes and villains, but as a brutal audit of national capacities. Their journey did not end with the American victory. A new shock awaited them upon their return to Japan. What happens when you survive a war your country has lost, bearing witness to a truth your homeland is not ready to hear? That is a story for another time. To explore that next chapter in this hidden history, subscribe to our channel. The conversations that begin here are important. She finished the chocolate. She was still hungry.